Imagine yourself in an ancient land, living by the sweat of your brow day in, day out. People around you barely survive, suffering from disease, hardships, nature. And through all this, you ask yourself, there has to be something more to life than this. Hey guys, welcome to this very first episode of the Veiled Path podcast. We're going to take you on a journey across this path through various religious traditions, spiritual practices, and developments. Welcome to the show. Please like and subscribe. Give us a follow. Be sure not to miss every new episode that drops. As they say, smash that like button. Welcome, guys. I'm Froylan. I'll be your host for this podcast. As this podcast is a podcast on esoteric spiritual practices, symbols, history, we're going to take a deep dive into the various religious traditions and also the underlying aspects that are esoteric to every religious tradition, but find themselves as part of the perennial human tradition. So, who am I? I was always a very spiritually inclined person, even as a child. I remember having experiences when I was young of the supernatural, but also, unexplained things. I wasn't raised in any specific religious tradition, but I had family that belonged to several other traditions. My father's side was Catholic. My mother had come out of the Jehovah's Witness religion. So I was introduced to several of those growing up and their view on things. As I got older, I started to open myself up to learning. I was influenced by concepts from the East. I became aware first of prayer, but also meditation. And when I was young, I really tried to start learning anything I could. After high school, I started to join actual organizations to begin understanding what these traditions really are. As I got older, though, I traveled a bit. So I explored various avenues from evangelical to Anglo Episcopal. Um, I ended up making my way into Roman Catholicism, subsequently studying Eastern Orthodoxy. And at some point, I began to feel like my spiritual demeanor wasn't really just confined to one particular religion. I started to feel like my practices, my ideas just didn't really fit in one particular tradition. Other people might have this experience where you feel like as you share these thoughts and share these inclinations while in a particular tradition, you might find that you're just rubbing people the wrong way because they belong to this set tradition with these established parameters. So you don't want to shake the waters, so to speak. So I began to quietly explore and follow where my heart was taking me. But I just learned that I wasn't really confined to one specific religious tradition. It was through that I discovered really buried underneath these traditions, like I said, is an esoteric aspect to every religion, which once submerged into the esoteric, you start to find that these are rooted and connected to all the traditions. So beyond that, I started studying the different forms of Hinduism. And also, once you start learning about Hinduism, you'll very quickly come across Buddhist history. I've also always had a personal fascination with the Tao, Chinese spirituality, Chinese history. So I began also studying Taoism. And it's through all these studies across my life that I arrive here to bring you this show. where we'll talk about these ideas, we're going to explore them, hash them out, but also how all of these find their way into the American life today. Our American life is at a very unique juncture in history. And I believe now more than ever is a time where perhaps we should be opening ourselves up to these ideas of spirituality in the wisdom traditions and see how that can revitalize our American culture and take us to new frontiers. Imagine yourself in an ancient land, living by the sweat of your brow, day in, day out. People around you barely survive, suffering from disease, hardships, nature. And through all this, you ask yourself, there has to be something more to life than this. At some point, ancient man might have asked themselves, what is beyond all this? And as that question got asked across time, people came up with different answers. At some point, somebody asked the question, who am I and who am I really? Feeling that sense that somewhere buried deep down, all this stuff, I have a core identity that has to continue on. All these things that I've taken in, these perceptions, are they really going to stop when I die? And it's this question of who am I that we come across the beginnings of the self and how this idea of the self was explored and discussed among these various cultures. Now, in this first episode, we're going to talk about the self as understood through the Eastern religions primarily. I wanted to do this first episode exploring all the traditions, but I realized that was too long of an episode. So in this episode, we're going to focus primarily on the East. And then in a subsequent episode, we'll begin to understand how these notions made their way into the West through the Western religions. As we begin this episode, we're going to discover that things weren't documented to begin with. Earliest concepts of the self were explored through oral tradition in primarily shamanic cultures. In a village, there were designated people known as shamans who were the spiritual leaders of a tribe or a group. As these shamanic practices were given to individuals, we know that some of these practices involved perhaps drug-induced states, breathing techniques, physical exercises, things aimed at bringing somebody into a trance-like state where they can separate their mind from their body and understand that there's something buried deep within the outer layer. These things primarily were not categorized. It's not until later that we find that these concepts were beginning to be written down and then explored and debated. One of the earliest civilizations we know to have done this was the early Brahmanic culture in India. The Brahmins were an elite priestly caste group who began to write down their prayers, their mantras, and the names of their gods and how to make offerings to please the gods. As we progress through this conversation of the self, we're going to encounter ideas of the divine, whether that's gods plural or a single God entity that surpasses all known things, along with the notion of the self. And while cultures and religions do mostly draw hardline distinctions between all these things, we're going to find buried beneath the surface that these barriers are very, very ephemeral. And how that gets explained is where the challenge comes in. So in the early Brahmanic culture, their religion primarily did start out with a sacrificial rite system. Concepts of the self were not present yet. They saw themselves as individuals and servants of the gods. They pleased the gods, and in turn, the gods will bless them. So, what did the Brahmins compose? What the Brahmins wrote eventually was called the Vedas. As we know, the early Vedas are a form of prayers and sacrifices and rites to offer to the gods. As these were developed into India's religious culture, India then became a very hierarchical caste system where the Brahmins were the top of the caste system. As these practices developed around 1000 to 800 BCE, we start to see that these rites that were so prescribed and down to a science were now being thought of outside of the box. People began to interpret them symbolically, where you have the outer form of the worship, but also the inner disposition begins to matter too. And that is something now used to aid the outer practice. So we begin to experience this sense of the outside life and the inner life as being separate, but can be fused into one energy, one force. Shortly after that, we begin to see renunciants appear on the scene. So, trying to escape the life of the caste system, these people became renunciants and retired away into the forest, where they began to develop other practices like meditation and yogic spiritual practices. It's these forest dwellers that were later going to be called rishis, who began writing down their spiritual practices and experiences and discovering the more esoteric underlying aspects that flourished eventually in India and gave rise to new forms of religion. These writings were eventually going to be known as the Upanishads, but we're going to get to that in a second. Simultaneously, while the right system is going on in India, we receive a story in history of a man who grew up a prince, and while he was young and in his early adulthood had been sheltered from the outside world in order to protect him from the outside hardships and realities that exist beyond the palace. It was one day where he was being taken as a treat outside of the palace walls, where he then was exposed to the hardships of daily life. He saw a man who was old and crippled, and he began to ask his attendant, "What kind of person is this?" And they explained to him, "This is an old man. This is what's going to happen to all of us." As they journey on, he encountered a man who was sick, and he asked the same question, and they explained to him, "This is sickness. This happens to all people." And after that, they come across a corpse, and same thing. He's told, "This is death. This is going to happen to all of us." This young prince was so very disturbed and could not escape the thoughts and the worries that came to him immediately after this adventure. So he decided that he needed to find out the secrets to escaping these things and how he can alleviate the suffering that came from his discovery of all these things. This man, we know, was Siddhartha Gautama, who was later going to be called the Buddha. He spent 8 years of his life studying ascetic practices. This also included the yogic spiritual practices. There were various schools, various practices in India, and he went to the ones that he could find that would teach him liberation. And we actually see in historical records, at least from his followers, that it was during this time that he really practiced some heavy spiritual asceticism, almost to the point of death. When he started to come away from those practices and find a better balance, one particular day, he sat underneath the Bodhi tree and decided to meditate ongoing until he found enlightenment. In this sitting meditation, he came across 3 revelations. First, he received a revelation of past lives witnessed by himself. So, an idea that whatever made up the parts of his mind had lived previously through other incarnations in the past. He then explored the nature of suffering. What is the root cause of this suffering? And then finally, he achieved his goal and found the way to escape the suffering, what he called nirvana. Following this discovery and his enlightenment, he began to take disciples and begin explaining what his teachings were and his discoveries and how everyone can achieve this state that he found himself in. Meanwhile, amongst the forest renunciates, were receiving the teachings that were going to be written down and documented into what was later known as the Upanishads. In the Upanishads, we are now given terms and distinctions and how these distinctions relate to each other. It's in these Upanishads that we come across a term called Atman. The Atman was described as one's ultimate self. So while the world itself is subject to change and is very illusory as it's always in a constant state of change, the innermost self is called the Atman, and the Atman is a fixed state that is the witness to all the phenomena that we're living through. The Atman itself is the part that will go on and thus reincarnate across times. It's also in the Upanishads that we are now given the term Brahman, where Brahman is defined as the cosmic self, what we would call God. But this God is less of a being, as the Hindus call it. Nirguna Brahman is a ground upon which all being arises. It is a God without qualities, without personality, and is an impartial God. Alongside this time, as the Buddhists were being developed under the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, we find these two major primary spiritual movements emerging and dominating the scene. We have the Upanishadic religions, and we have the Buddhist practices. And while the Buddha originally was very nuanced in how he gave particular individual prescriptions to individuals based on how he read their character and their dispositions, the Buddhists had to formulate their own doctrines in order to distinguish themselves from the Hindu caste religion system. So the Buddhists really saw the caste system and the priestly system as an abuse. They thought that they were gatekeeping liberation from the masses. And Buddha, along with Buddhist followers, wanted to make that mainstream for everybody. Their teaching was that regardless of your caste, you can join the Buddhist monks and begin to meditate and practice with them and attain nirvana as well. So while the Upanishadic system developed the concept of the Atman and Brahman, subsequently on the other side, Buddhists developed their notions. And in one of the earliest sermons given by the Buddha in the Dhammapada, which is the writings of the Buddha's teaching, we're given the concept anatta. Anatta is no self. So what does this mean? First, let's go and discover the main doctrines that were established by the Buddha and the Buddhist followers and how these are consolidated, canonized, and given to us today. So the doctrines laid out by Buddha and the Buddhist followers were called the Four Noble Truths. We might know what these are. They've come across history for a long time. But just to review, the Four Noble Truths. First one is dukkha, suffering. We find ourselves in a state of suffering. This can be labeled as an actual suffering. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody who is going through a state of turmoil. It just means that we are stuck in this cycle of incarnation, and it's sort of the record is on repeat, and we want to escape that cycle. So we find ourselves in the cycle. That's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is that as a result of this dukkha, we find ourselves craving and desiring. And this here is the core of our suffering. As a result of our reincarnation and physical manifestation, craving is the underlying force that keeps this cycle perpetuating. So it's because of this craving that we are suffering. The third noble truth is that there is a way out. We need not be stuck in this cycle of suffering and craving. The third noble truth is that there is the possibility to break this cycle. The fourth noble truth is nirvana, liberation. How do we achieve that? Beyond the Four Noble Truths, then Buddha prescribes the Eightfold Path. What is the Eightfold Path? It is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood and ethics, right effort, such as having positivity in your demeanor, right mindfulness, the awareness, the thoughts, the feelings, and right concentration, which is the meditative practice. So it's through this prescription that one person can achieve their liberation. Now, through all this, nowhere in there was Brahman, the concept of a god, or the gods introduced to any of this. Why is that? So in the second sermon, when Buddha discusses anatta, this is where we get the doctrine of no self. While the Upanishadic religions developed the concept of the self and Brahman, the Buddhists, on the other hand, saw this as something else beyond ourselves to cling to. And as through this, we see it as a violation or falling in line with the second noble truth of craving and desire. It's something else to cling to, that which we should not be doing in order to receive our liberation. So how the Buddhists prescribed this was the doctrine of anatta. We need to move away from any concept of a self. That concept is something that will lead us to continue our suffering. How then do they explain all this? People, matter, form are part of five things known as the five aggregates. In the five aggregates, we got form, which is our body. We got our feelings, perception, so our mental perceptions, our innermost feeling perceptions, and then we have our consciousness. These are 5 different things. Now, these are 5 things that they would describe as empty or without fixed points in reality. All these 5 things are constantly subject to change, and thus they're not the ultimate. Once we encounter these 5 aspects of ourselves and our being, we're then told to move past them. Not cling to them, just let them be and move beyond. So it's through all this then that the Buddha would prescribe going through all these step by step, encountering these parts of ourselves, dropping them as they're not the self, they can't be possessed, moving beyond them. And once you learn that ultimately, if you are not a self, then there's nothing inside of you that is actually suffering. This state that feels like it's suffering is something that is controlling your mind at the moment, but there's nothing inside that is suffering. In essence, the Buddha would be saying that you are allowing this concept of suffering to trick you when your natural state is not suffering. Your natural state would be inclined to compassion and joy. So the Buddha would prescribe to realize this ultimate sense of no self and then be in bliss. This Buddhist movement took over most of India. And so not many people know that at this point in history, Buddhism was a very fast growing movement and took over almost the whole country, where India became primarily a Buddhist country. During this time, though, the Hindu religious systems were starting to feel that while the Buddha introduced some good reforms, ultimately they threw the baby out with the bathwater. There was no talk of God or the gods, and the ancient systems that they had been given had introduced these concepts. So why were they no longer going to be discussed? There needed to be a sense of continuity with the Buddha's discoveries. At this time now, we find ourselves in a bit of a pushback where the Hindus wanted to debate the Buddhist ideas, but also explain why their concepts and the Vedas themselves needed to be preserved. Along this time comes a monk who's a bit of a prodigy, a very young monk named Adi Shankara. Shankara was a genius monk who had studied the spiritual practices of India, studied the Vedas, and decided to reform the Hindu religions and develop them alongside the Upanishadic scriptures and recategorize and introduce the Buddhist concepts of liberation and personal liberation to the masses. This is the development of the idea known as Advaita Vedanta. So what is this term, Advaita Vedanta? We're going to get into that. Vedanta simply means the end of the Vedas. So the Vedas in the beginning were rites and mantras dedicated to the gods. They were simply actions to take in order to please the gods, but the later Upanishads were more philosophical teachings. And so that's where Vedanta comes in. The Upanishads were really the end of the Vedas. In this, Adi Shankara starts to debate the Buddhists. He adopts their meditation practices, but also is not denying that the foundation of the being is indeed the Atman. And he began to debate and argue with Buddhists that their notions were a little bit nihilistic because they felt that if one person is seeking liberation, then who is the person seeking that liberation? A Buddhist would say there's no self, so no self is trying to find liberation. But that defied the face of logic. And it was Adi Shankara who would debate the Buddhists that pointed this out. It was along this time that he reformed the Hindu religions and started to categorize them into their different tribes and camps. But it was Adi Shankara who reintroduced this concept of the self along with the Buddhist practices. And so in Shankara's system, we now see the distinctions drawn out further. So we have a person's ultimate being as the self or the Atman. Above the Atman, the ground of all being is Brahman. So we also now find the connection where a person's ultimate self being the Atman is not separate, but is Brahman. So the highest realization of a person, while it used to be Atman as a separate entity from Brahman, we also see that there is no distinction. So this is where Advaita comes in. All of reality is not separate. We don't have one spiritual cosmic entity and a bunch of physical manifestations. Everything that is in existence is not two things. So not two things or more than two things. While this isn't specifically called monism, some people call it monism. That would just mean everything is one thing. But to be very specific and very honest to this tradition, they don't even call it monism. They simply just call it non-dualism. So that leaves a bit of ambiguity there. To call it one thing is a fixed and solid point. But if we're saying it is infinite, how can infinity have an end to be categorized as one thing? It's ongoing and never ending. It's infinite. So we can't categorize it as one thing, but we know it's not two, if that makes sense. So now we see the elevation of the Atman and its connection to the all, the ultimate, which is Brahman. So along this time, the Advaitins and the Buddhists began to debate each other, and slowly but surely, eventually, the Buddhists began to lose these debates, and they were perceived as being a more nihilistic religion. And it's around this time that the Buddhists decided to move on into a different area. Now, one disclaimer about Hindu religion. Just to be fair, of all the various philosophies and traditions that encompass Hinduism in India, while Adi Shankara was one philosopher who developed this very eloquent and most famous teaching in India of Advaita, it's actually just one of the few primary philosophies of India. So in Advaita, their teaching is that the self is the innermost core that is in a fixed state of all people. And through the self-realization, you encounter the Atman and you realize the Atman. And in that reality of the Atman is Brahman. So while Adi Shankara's philosophy of non-dualism placed God in this attainable sense of being equal with the Atman, that didn't sit well with certain devotional sects of Hinduism, where they wanted to see God as still being somewhat separate and beyond themselves and in control of their own lives. So we see two other philosophies come later in time. First one being Vishishta Advaita, which was developed by the monk Ramanuja. So Vishishta Advaita is called qualified non-dualism. And what does that mean? That simply means that while all things are Brahman, we acknowledge that. But yet the force and entity that is Brahman is everything and more. What that more is beyond. That's the mystery of God. So just to qualify these into more Western ideas, you could say that Shankara's idea was a type of pantheism, where all things ultimately are God, and that is God. What we see in Ramanuja's philosophy, it would be called panentheism, where it's God, yes, but God is also more and beyond. So both. Following Ramanuja's philosophy, we get a more intense philosophy that came to us called Dvaita. Not Advaita, but Dvaita. So what is Dvaita? That simply means two. So we see the separation that we, as the Atman, are a lesser self, and we are an individual soul. So our spirit reincarnates and goes through the cycle. If we want to be liberated, we have our God realization, and we can fuse our soul with the divine, and we can live with the divine in the heavenly abode, but we still stay and remain separate from the ultimate divine, being God. The way I've heard monks actually explain this, I've actually really appreciated this explanation, but you have ultimately, we have the middle ground between not two and multiple, so two, multiple. But the way that they described it was, if you have ants collecting sugar, and they love sugar, all these ants love sugar, you will have ants that collect the sugar, and they're simply in bliss through the taste of sugar. They love it so much, but they really ultimately love the experience that they get from tasting sugar. While you would have ants that eat the sugar, love the sugar, and have this interaction with the sugar. You might also have ants that take it a step deeper, and they love sugar so much that they no longer identify themselves as the experiencer of sugar, but they want to be sugar. They love it that much. So through this non-dualism, you might have this concept of You want to move past this idea of the sensation of sugar, and you love it that much that you want to fuse with it and be sugar. Or it's perfectly okay to love the taste of that sugar, to go on experiencing that taste of sugar and constantly be in that relationship with it. Hinduism would say both are okay. While you might have people debating on one is the ultimate and one is higher than the other, at this point, as we've seen it so long in history, it's really just accepted that it's just your taste. It's who you are, your understandings, and your disposition, and where that will take you. Coming back to Buddhism, Buddhism began to migrate away from India, now moving into a different region, primarily in China. As Buddhism migrated away from India, it began to send missionaries into the Chinese regions. In the Chinese regions, these Buddhists began to discover what the other religious teachings were in China. In China, we discovered that the primary philosophies of the day were mainly Confucianism and a philosophy known as Taoism. So, what are these two religions that Buddhism encountered in China? First, we discuss Confucianism. Confucius was a philosopher who believed in an established order, and he believed in the harmony between the heavenly realm and the physical realm. And through these rites that place somebody in their right status and their right connection with the heavenly realm and themselves, so the same is established among society. So while you have deities and ancestors and lesser beings across hierarchies, we saw that established in the government society, where you would have an emperor, the emperor's aristocracy, and down from that into the serfs. Where you landed in that determined your etiquette, your role and subservience. The idea of self as laid out in Confucianism is not whatsoever an individualistic idea. Your self is a fluid concept that changes based on your own status and can change at any one point between who you're around at any given time. The self could be different if you are in the presence of the emperor versus yourself could be different whether you're talking to a family member or your own children. That is fluid and it's subject to change. There was no real concept of an individual self that goes on in perpetuity. It's connected to everything else, your family, your connections, and the heavenly realm and the state of the government. Around the same time that Confucius was writing down his Analects, simultaneously, we encounter the mythical figure who was later going to write down his philosophy in what was going to be known as the Tao Te Ching. So this figure, we're given the name Lao Tzu. We now have good reason to suspect that Lao Tzu never actually existed, but the teachings of the Tao Te Ching were given to us through a particular region of China where this philosophy came into development through oral tradition. And perhaps it was a single person writing them down. Perhaps it was multiple people documenting these and somebody collected all the sayings. But through the mythology, we are given the story that as Lao Tzu reached a late stage of his life, he decided to leave the region. And as he was leaving the region, he was stopped by a guard. And the guard asked who he was. And when the guard discovered who he was, he asked for his teachings. And that was when Lao Tzu decided to write down the Tao Te Ching and gave it to the guard and left. So what is in the Tao Te Ching? The Tao Te Ching is a book of philosophy, but it was a particular philosophy as we saw through the interplay between Buddhist philosophy and its relationship to Hinduism and early Brahmanic culture. We see the same thing with the Tao Te Ching in its relationship to Confucianism. While Confucianism lays out particular rites and orders and hierarchies and how to be sensitive to all those things, the Tao Te Ching scraps all that. It brings the sense of individuality back to people and at times even makes a mockery of the social order. But the underlying philosophy of the Tao Te Ching is that there is a Tao, translated as the way, that is defined and dictated by the whims of nature. But it can be discerned, it can be understood. And for a person to understand that, a person must then align themselves with that cosmic way. And when you align yourself with the flow of that way, everything in your life will be better and simpler. And simplicity is the ultimate state a person strives for. It's also in Taoism that we begin to bring back the notion, like I said, of individuality, where from an individual single standpoint, they can discern the outer microcosm, so everything that is appearing outside of themselves, and the inner microcosm, and the two are really the same. Through interaction with one, you then have that interaction occur in the other. In the out, you will have manifestations, great bodies, planets in the heavens. These are almost like, entities in the body. So you might have great bodies outside. We have those inside: the heart, the liver, the kidneys. You have space, open space, and ether, which was perceived as being inside, as these hollow points in the body where nothing exists. And that idea of nothing, the innermost core, is kind of the focal point of Taoism, that ultimately the true state of all things is emptiness. Once you become empty, you're free. It's in the emptiness that all the phenomena of life, manifestation can occur. And it's done at its best through spontaneity. So we will find developed even later past the Tao Te Ching through another philosopher known as Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi explains and elaborates more on the concept of spontaneity, and it's through spontaneity that nature takes its course, and we just simply allow nature to flow through us. Our job is to not get in the way of that nature. One of the final terms that was coined in Taoism that is really important even to today is known as Wu Wei. And Wu Wei simply means effortless action. It might sometimes be described as non-action, but that's not the best definition because it's not simply doing nothing. It's finding the most simplest and straightforward way to approach anything based on the flow of the Tao. For example, take a rushing river. If you're trying to cross a river, you wouldn't necessarily want to walk into that river going against the tide. The current of the river is going to push against you, and you're going to get tired and perhaps drown. Whereas if you move perpendicular, but with the flow of the water, it might take a little longer, but it is the simplest way to approach it. You need not get there as fast as possible, but you should get there the simplest way as possible. And that is Wu Wei. As I said, our innermost being is empty. So it's this emptiness which creates the cosmic field for life to develop. So in Taoism, they have their own spiritual exercises, and it's actually through developed Taoist teaching where we get the innermost self as laid out and philosophized in Taoism. It's an energy center at the very core of the belly, 3 fingers below the navel, known as the Dantian. The Dantian is sort of the battery center of every human. That's our power core. It's the charge of our whole body. All things begin in the Dantian, and they flow from there. Again, all these notions, all these ideas, they're meant to just provide a sort of framework and understanding where you can talk directly about the self and what it is. But as you begin to describe that self, you begin to lose touch with the reality the more you begin to label and term things. This is finally Taoism's main point, that language itself is not the ultimate. While philosophers might want to sit and philosophize all day and all night, using words to describe things that we see in reality, they are not themselves the reality. It's only through one's direct perception and witness that somebody is going to gain understanding of that ultimate. Here in Taoism, where you start to encounter more poetic language and some confusing language, because it's ultimately meant to display the futility of the entire project to explain it. But through that language, one person can understand and perceive that truth and perhaps gain a grasp of a true and ultimate understanding. As I explained, Buddhism had migrated into China, and now China being a hotbed of the 2 main philosophies, which, as I've said, were Confucianism and Taoism. Buddhism encountered and began to intermingle and dialogue with these 2 philosophies. As Buddhism discovered these hierarchy systems, it also discovered these anti-hierarchy systems and found compatibility with both and decided to insert itself right in the middle and began to adopt some of the philosophies found as established amongst the common folk and bring it into Buddhism, but at the main underlying core was the Buddhist teachings. Around 500 BC, while Buddhism was already established in China, a sojourner named Bodhidharma in legend was said to have arrived on China standing on a reed or a log floating down a river. Word spread very fast as Bodhidharma was very famous in India, and word had gotten around that he was coming to China. As he was about to end his journey into China, word had spread so fast that word had been given to the emperor that this famous monk was about to arrive. The emperor asked to speak to Bodhidharma, and when Bodhidharma arrived, the emperor was there to greet him, and he wanted answers immediately from this wise monk. So he asked Bodhidharma directly, look at all these monasteries, look at all these structures that I have built for these Buddhist monks in my land. I ask you, what merits have I earned after doing all this? Bodhidharma looked at him and simply answered, no merit. The emperor was probably taken aback by this and deeply offended. So he asked him a second question. What is the highest truth? Bodhidharma answered, vast emptiness, nothing holy. By this time now, the emperor is wondering who this guy thinks he is to address him like this. So he asks him directly, who is it that I'm speaking to right now? And Bodhidharma, getting to the ultimate answer based on his understanding, simply said, I don't know. There are many legends and stories associated with this man, Bodhidharma, but what we do know is that he was coined as the first patriarch of a movement in Buddhism known as Chan Buddhism, and later to be called Zen Buddhism as it arrived in Japan. Chan Buddhism encountered Taoism and began to mix and see some parallel teachings from the Buddhist teachings in Tao. They began to adopt some of the practices of the Taoists and bring them into their core practices of Chan or Zen Buddhism. For example, in Taoism, we saw the practice known as Zhuowang. Zhuowang was the process of sit and forget. It was a practice given to us by Zhuangxi that the best practice of Taoism is this method of Zhuowang, where one simply sits and forgets. You forget your body sensations. You forget that you even have a body. You forget your thoughts. You move past them and move into direct perception of reality. Chan Buddhism adopted this, and the practice developed even further into what was later known in Japan as Zazen, as Chan Buddhism moved into Japan and became Zen. Of Taoism into Buddhism, we then see these teachings come out from their saints, where we have further dialogues about the concept of emptiness, that ultimate reality is nothing, but not simply nothing. It's more coined as no thing. It's not something that can be explained or described, and words, as we've learned, cannot convey the ultimate truth. It's only through the practices that one can directly perceive the truth. We were given further tools, later known as koans. And in Zen, a koan is a sort of absurd statement or question given to the meditating person to take with them, to dwell on, but also is meant to help the person move past a sense of average thinking and logic. Logic is not going to get one to perceive the ultimate reality. In this tradition, ultimate reality is beyond logic. And these koans are meant to break that thinking mind and to move past it. But through these practices, one can move into a state known as satori, another form of liberation. And once in the state of satori, they take that with them for the remainder of their life. This state of satori brings the ultimate state known as no mind. A being's best ability is this ability of no mind, where the ultimate state is empty and spontaneous. And that is the ultimate expression of nature. As we move into the Chinese region, we might discover that God and the ultimate does not make itself known in these philosophies and this religion. The Chinese region never really developed this concept of a single ultimate creator God. And so Buddhism, having done the same, saw no problem with finding compatibility with these religions. And that is ultimately why Buddhism became harmonious with these other two philosophies. And so now in China, really the three main patriarchs of all Chinese philosophy are Confucius, Lao Tzu, and now the Buddha. That does not mean that God cannot be discussed or ultimately discerned from all the teachings found in Zen philosophy. There are Zen practitioners across time who've attempted to have ecumenical dialogue with other religions and find commonality in the concept of God. For example, Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese Zen practitioner, very much often spoke about God and interacting with the being through practices such as prayer found in other religions. Except in Zen, he strictly defined it as the ground of all being, and was clear when he said, when he speaks of God, if other people are intending to mean that term God as the ground of all being, then he has no problem with it. And he continued to use it that way for the rest of his life. Also, a more ancient Japanese Zen priest and thinker was a man named Dogen. And Dogen, through his many works, spoke of a term called uji, which is time and ultimate reality. Now, he describes uji in terms that could be compared to concepts that are discussed about God. But uji itself in Dogen and further Zen minds would draw distinctions, saying it is not a God per se. It's not a person. It's not possessive, and it has no characteristics. While it is an ultimate force, as described, it's fully pure awareness across time. He would not describe that as God. And also in Buddhism, we're given other terms that could be compared to notions of the self, such as the Tathagata Garbha, or the Buddha nature of all beings, where all people possess an innermost nature, we'll call it, known as Buddha nature. Buddha nature is a potentiality. It's a concept of development where our ultimate core, while not a possessive self, something to be grasped that is fixed beyond time, it is our ultimate nature. So our ultimate nature itself, while empty also, is something that brings us to bliss and happiness, known as the Buddha nature. The terms used of this Buddha nature can be compared to the Advaita notions of the self, the only deviation being this self is something possessed by the individual, while the concept of Buddha nature is fluid. So, to wrap some of this conversation up, I wanted to give you 3 arguments that the Advaitins would have towards the Buddhists as to why they believe there is a self. The first argument would be the concept of I am. When we claim we're suffering, when we claim we are experiencing joy, that concept of I am, so I, the individual, am, is buried deep within us. It must come from somewhere. It's something that is so solidified to our heart that it seems beyond delusion. Who is the one saying I am? The next argument would be through the process of change, this world, we see change as a constant, but we also feel a sense of continuity. So what is this sense in us that while things are changing, we are basing that from a particular standpoint where we notice the continuity? If there was no ultimate self, how could we truly discern those things? Yes, we're using written records to help us piece this together, but our perceptions find something much deeper. Finally, this concept of anatta, or no self, was argued by the Advaitins to be a nihilistic principle, that if you get down past the skandhas, there being nothing, that was perceived as being a nihilistic principle, that nothing is real and nothing is true. Everything is a delusion. But if there is a self experiencing all this, and it could be argued that it's beyond all the physical phenomena, all sensation, all emotion, then that is a positive principle. And that is what life is based on. Reversely, Buddhists would just argue simply that You don't need a concept of the self for any of this, that the skandhas alone provide the answers needed, but also that the concept of the self is just something, again, that is going to lead somebody to suffer. You don't need a concept of the self to attain liberation. In fact, they argue if you remove this concept of a self, something that's not fixed, there is nothing to base your suffering on, ultimately. There's no self. They don't see it as a nihilistic principle. They actually see it as a liberating principle, that through no self, every individual is free and open. There's nothing stopping you from experiencing the bliss and wonders of the life that you're here to experience. They do believe that ultimately it's constantly subject to change. It's interdependent with everything else, but there's nothing bringing you down. So to wrap it up, across Advaita to Buddhism, from Tao to Zen, across these Eastern lands, through all these teachings, beyond categories, we find that the path that we've been led down is being perceived as through a veil, where all these things that are argued about and discussed have an underlying commonality, and it's only through our direct perception that we can pierce that veil and look directly into the heart of reality. We might find that the self is not something you can categorize, but that it's something that you yourself will need to do the work to see directly and understand. So every episode, I would like to give some recommendations for my listeners. Anything that inspires me, that I enjoy, or brought me some more understanding for the development of this episode. So in this episode, I'd like to recommend 3 books that have made an impact on my life, that gave me further understanding in the heart of these teachings. I'm going to start with one of my favorites, the Tao Te Ching. So I like this particular translation by Ken Liu. He's a great translator and author, but this one is a very modern translation. If you want to just get a more conversational take on the Tao Te Ching, I definitely recommend this translation. Every translation of the Tao Te Ching is very different from one another. The Chinese language brings us these various translations in English. I love it, but I definitely recommend this one. Second was my understanding and development in Zen. So exploring Chan. So Chan, again, is the Chinese form of Zen Buddhism. It is very different in how they practice in Japan. So in Chan, their setup of monasteries and their monastic formation is different than you would find in Japan. But Chan explains sort of the heart of their teaching and how these Taoist principles were adopted, how Chan developed in China, and where it was taken to Japan beyond that. I definitely recommend this book. It sort of is a survey, a broad survey, and covers pretty much everything, but I love it. And it was written by Chuanzi. Finally, if you wish to understand further in Advaita, and I definitely recommend researching Advaita Vedanta, it is a very rich spiritual tradition. Particularly in this country, we have the Ramakrishna monks who have been responsible for a lot of my teaching and a lot of my understanding. So I recommend the Brahma Sutra Bhāsya. This is the commentary of the Brahma Sutras. So in Advaita Vedanta, they have their main scriptures really come from the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very famous written work about God and man and our relationship. The Brahma Sutras is the philosophical outline for Advaita Vedanta. So this form of Advaita Vedanta is very ancient. It has been further developed, but if you wish to get to the core of the original philosophy, the Brahma Sutra Bhāsya, and Bhāsya simply means commentary. So this is the work of the Brahma Sutra with Shankara's commentary. So I recommend these 3 works, guys. Check them out. Let me know if you like them in the comment box. If you have further recommendations, I would love to see them. I love getting book recommendations and I run out and buy them quickly. So feel free to give them to me. I'm always going to be looking for those. Thank you guys for listening. Again, subscribe, hit the notification icon, and smash that like button. We'll be back next time for part 2 of this episode. Thank you guys. And remember, walk the path.